Good evening, time traveler. Settle into your pillow, get comfortable, and prepare for another journey through history. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where darkness meant something entirely different than it does today. A world where nightfall transformed familiar streets into alien territory, and sleep was less a period of rest than an exercise in survival. We're exploring what it was actually like to spend a night in a medieval European town, roughly between the 11th and 14th century. This isn't the Romanized version you see in films, with flickering torches illuminating picturesque cobblestone streets. This is the real experience. The sounds, smells, fears, and challenges that accompanied every sunset in an era when night belonged to forces that daylight kept at bay. Before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see how far these historical journeys travel. And if there's another period of history you'd like to explore, let me know. Your suggestions help shape future episodes. Let's start our journey as the sun begins its descent over a typical medieval town. The first sign that evening was approaching didn't come from the sun's position in the sky. It came from the church bell. This bell, known as the curfew bell, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, echoed through narrow, winding streets, signaling to everyone that darkness was coming. Imagine a citywide alarm that told you it was time to stop everything and prepare for lockdown. That's essentially what the curfew bell meant. The sound carried across the town with remarkable clarity. Medieval towns were small by our standards, often housing just a few thousand souls within defensive walls. Think of it as a densely packed neighborhood rather than a city, where the church bell could reach every corner, from the wealthiest merchant's home to the poorest laborer's hovel. The streets during daylight hours were already challenging. Picture alleyways so narrow that two people had difficulty passing each other, flanked by timber-framed buildings that leaned inward until their upper stories nearly touched overhead. The ground beneath your feet was packed earth, or if you were in a more prosperous section, irregular cobblestones that formed a puzzle for every step you took. During the day, these streets teemed with life. Merchants called out their wares from shop windows that opened directly onto the street. Children wove between adults' legs in endless games. Pigs roamed loose, serving as the town's primary sanitation system by eating refuse. Yes, pigs in the streets, because medieval urban planning had its own unique approach to waste management. But when that bell rang, everything changed. The transformation happened gradually, but inevitably. Merchants began shuttering their windows, literal shutters, since most shops were simply the ground floor of houses with openings that could be closed with wooden boards. People quickened their pace, hurrying to reach home before darkness made the streets dangerous. The bustling energy that filled daylight hours drained away like water through a cracked vessel. Public lighting was a concept that wouldn't arrive for several more centuries. A few wealthy towns might have oil lamps at strategic locations, major intersections near important buildings, but these created small islands of weak, yellowish light rather than actual illumination. Most people depended on torches, lanterns, or candles to navigate, creating a curious spectacle of tiny points of light bobbing through the darkness like oversized fireflies with questionable navigation skills. The air itself began to change. During the day, the town's scents were complex. Fresh bread from bakeries, spices from merchants' stalls, human sweat, animal dung, and the ever-present background note of medieval sanitation systems that left much to be desired. At night, these smells intensified and blended differently. The air grew heavier, more humid, carrying odors in concentrated form. It was as if someone had taken all the day's smells and compressed them into a denser, more potent mixture. As windows began to glow with the weak light of candles and hearth fires, the town's appearance shifted dramatically. This wasn't the warm, cozy glow you might imagine. The light was yellow, wavering, creating shadows that danced and shifted on walls like living things. Window glass, when it existed at all, came in small, thick, irregular panes that distorted light in strange ways. Most simpler homes had no glass at all, just wooden shutters or oiled cloth coverings. The soundscape transformed completely. The daytime cacophony, voices, cartwheels, hammering from smithies, barking dogs, gave way to something more sinister. Wood creaked as buildings settled in the cooling air. Wind whistled between houses. Footsteps echoed on stone. And occasionally there came distant shouts that people learned not to question too closely. Sometimes it was better not to know. People moved differently after dark. They walked fast, glanced around more frequently, traveled in groups when possible. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Medieval streets at night hosted thieves, drunks, occasional wild animals that ventured into town, and other hazards both real and imagined that made every shadow potentially dangerous. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind crooked roof lines and thatched roofs, the medieval town underwent its nightly metamorphosis. It was no longer the same place. The streets, the houses, the very air, everything took on a different character. Picture someone swapping the scenery of a play between acts, using the same physical elements, but creating an entirely new atmosphere, not unlike a familiar room that becomes strange and unsettling when all the lights go out. Even the bravest knight thought twice before venturing out for an evening stroll. And this was just the beginning. We haven't even entered the houses yet, where families prepared to face the challenges of a medieval night. Let's step inside and discover what awaited those who called these towns home. To understand medieval sleep, we first need to understand medieval homes. And to enter one, you'd need to duck. Doorways were low, significantly lower than modern standards. This wasn't merely about saving building materials. A low doorway forced any potential intruder to bend over while entering, making them vulnerable to attack from inside. Clever security design, certainly, though it also meant the residents had to develop excellent posture awareness or risk frequent encounters between skull and doorframe. A typical middle-class home, let's say an artisan's or small merchant's residence, was a narrow, tall structure of 2 or 3 stories. The ground floor served as a workshop or shop. The first floor provided living space. The second floor, when present, contained sleeping quarters. The whole building was perhaps 20 feet wide and stretched back 40 to 60 feet, like a deep, narrow box standing on end. Climbing to the upper floors meant navigating wooden stairs that announced your every movement. These stairs didn't merely creak. They performed entire symphonies of complaint with each step. The concept of acoustic privacy simply didn't exist. If someone sneezed 3 houses down, you probably heard it. The walls themselves were constructed using timber frames filled with wattle and daub, interwoven sticks packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. You might call it sustainable construction today. Back then, it was simply what they had available. These walls had interesting properties. They were permeable, not in any poetic sense, but literally. Wind passed through them, rain sometimes joined in, and sounds? Sounds moved through medieval walls as if they were barely there. You heard your neighbors' conversations. You heard their arguments. You heard their children crying, their dogs barking, and occasionally sounds it was better to pretend you hadn't heard. Everyone knew everyone else's business, not through choice, but through simple architectural reality. The floors on upper levels were wooden planks, rough-hewn and uneven, full of splinters and gaps. Walking across them created another layer in the home's constant soundtrack. Some fortunate families had rugs or animal skins to cover portions of the floor, but most made do with rushes or straw, which needed regular replacement because they absorbed everything. Spills, dirt, and substances we needn't detail. Windows presented their own challenges. Glass was a luxury that few could afford. Most windows were simply openings in the wall, closable with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or paper if paper was available. During the day, these windows stayed open to admit light and air. At night, they were shuttered not just for warmth, but for protection against what lurked outside. Heat came from a central fireplace, or, in simpler homes, a brazier, a metal or ceramic container where charcoal or wood burned. The smoke found its way out through holes in the roof or windows as best it could. The result was a perpetually smoky environment that made eyes water and triggered the distinctive medieval cough that nearly everyone developed. Much like living in a room where someone's always burning incense, except the incense is actually just wood smoke, and there's no way to open a window to clear it out. For lighting, families relied on candles, rushlights, or oil lamps. Candles were expensive, made from beeswax or tallow, so they were used sparingly. Most families made do with 1 or 2 candles per evening, creating small pools of light that left most of the house in shadow. Envision living in a constant state of dim lighting, where most of your home existed in twilight even when you were trying to see clearly, and you'll begin to understand the medieval visual experience. Furniture was minimal and functional: a table, some benches or simple chairs, chests for storing clothes and belongings, which also served as extra seating and sometimes as makeshift beds for visitors, shelves on the walls. Everything made from wood, everything somewhat crooked, because precise carpentry was still developing as a craft. These chests were particularly important because they held everything the family owned. Think of them as combination closets, safes, and filing cabinets. A typical middle-class family might own 3 or 4 chests, each containing different categories of belongings. Breaking into someone's chest was a serious crime, not just because of theft, but because it violated the family's entire organizational system. The bathroom situation deserves its own discussion, though that discussion will be brief because medieval bathrooms were rudimentary at best. Most homes didn't have anything we'd recognize as a bathroom. Going to the toilet at night meant venturing outside to an outhouse, an adventure in itself that we'll discuss later, or using a chamber pot strategically positioned in the sleeping area. Chamber pots were ceramic vessels that collected what needed collecting during the night. They were emptied in the morning, usually by tossing contents into the street or into a cesspit in the yard. The smell of a used chamber pot was simply part of the medieval nighttime olfactory experience, along with wood smoke, cooking odors, and the general scent of multiple people living in close quarters without modern hygiene facilities. Privacy, as we understand it, was a concept that hadn't quite been invented yet. Families were large, houses were small. It wasn't unusual for parents, children, apprentices, servants, and occasional visitors all to share the same living space. The idea of having a room to yourself was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. Even they didn't always enjoy such privacy. Children slept where they could fit, in the family bed, on the floor with animal skins, on benches pushed together. Apprentices often slept in the workshop area. Servants had corners or small rooms in the attic or basement. Everyone understood that personal space was measured in inches, not feet. The temperature indoors was never quite right. In winter, the area near the fire roasted while the corners froze. In summer, the enclosed space became stifling, but opening windows invited insects and night air that many believed carried disease. The medical theory of the time held that night air was inherently unhealthy, filled with harmful vapors and bad humors, similar to believing that your air conditioning spreads illness, except they didn't have air conditioning, and the belief was actually about natural air itself. This was the stage upon which medieval nightlife played out, a dark, smoky, crowded, noisy environment where privacy was impossible and comfort was relative. Modern complaints about small apartments or thin walls pale in comparison to the medieval experience of home. And we haven't even discussed sleeping arrangements yet. But before we get to bed, there was the important ritual of the evening meal. Before anyone thought about sleep in a medieval household, there was the sacred ritual of supper. And when I say sacred, it's because it really was. Every meal began with prayer, regardless of whether the family was devoutly religious or merely going through the motion. Thanking God for food was mandatory, partly out of genuine gratitude and partly because, considering what sometimes appeared on the plate, a little divine endorsement couldn't hurt. The evening meal was typically the day's most substantial. Medieval people generally ate two main meals, one early in the morning and another in the late afternoon, before darkness fell. This second meal was called supper, which gave us our modern word for dinner. It was served around 5 or 6 in the evening because eating in the dark wasn't exactly practical, when your only light source was a candle that cost the equivalent of several hours' wages. The medieval table was a complete sensory experience. First, the smells. Picture the aroma of roasted meat when there was meat, mixed with herbs, fresh bread when available, beer or wine, and a constant background note of smoke from the hearth. It was a complex perfume that oscillated between appetizing and questionable, depending on the day and the family's fortune. The menu varied drastically according to social class and the season. A middle-class artisan's family might have dark bread, vegetable soup, some cheese, weak beer, and if they were lucky, a piece of pork or chicken. The poor subsisted on porridge made from oats, stale bread, and watered-down beer that was, oddly enough, safer to drink than water, which had a troubling tendency to cause intestinal diseases that nobody knew how to treat. Meat was a relative luxury. Pork was more common than beef because pigs were easier to raise in small spaces and could survive on scraps. Chicken and eggs appeared regularly on middle-class tables. Fish was common in towns near rivers or the sea, but limited transport meant that if you lived far from water, fresh fish was practically a legend you heard about from travelers. Vegetables, were genuinely seasonal. There were no greenhouses, no imports from warmer climates. In winter, the diet relied on preserved vegetables, fermented cabbage, turnips, onions, garlic, and whatever could be dried or kept in salt. Fresh fruits were a summer luxury. In winter, there were dried fruits for those who could afford them. Sugar was practically non-existent. Honey was the primary sweetener when there was any sweetening at all. Most sweet flavors came from the fruits themselves or from expensive spices like cinnamon, which cost more than most people's houses. Drinking water was risky, so everyone drank beer. Yes, everyone, including children. But don't worry, it wasn't the strong beer we know today. It was a weak brew with low alcohol content that served more as safe hydration than as an intoxicating beverage. Wine was for special occasions or for those with more money. The meal was eaten primarily with hands. Forks were rare and considered somewhat effeminate. A true medieval person ate with their hands and a knife. Spoons existed but were used mainly for soups. Plates were wooden or simple ceramic, and it wasn't uncommon for the entire family to share from the same serving dish. Hygiene was, shall we say, a developing concept. People might rinse their hands before eating, if water was readily available. The idea of thoroughly washing hands with soap was still foreign to most. You ate with the same hands that had been working all day, and that was simply how things were done. After the meal, there came the process of preparing the house for night. This included checking that all windows were securely closed, ensuring the hearth had enough wood to last until morning, and filling all water containers because going outside at night to fetch water was an adventure nobody wanted to undertake. Children were sent to bed first, naturally, but going to bed didn't mean going to a private room with a comfortable mattress. It meant finding a spot in the family sleeping area or on the floor with some animal skins and hoping not to be kicked during the night by siblings. Adults stayed up a bit longer, talking, telling stories, or doing small tasks that could be accomplished by the weak light of candles. Women sewed or spun thread. Men repaired tools or planned the next day's work. It was a moment of relative calm before facing the challenges of a medieval night. And what challenges were those? Well, that's what we're about to discover. For now, let's savor this last spoonful of lukewarm soup and prepare to explore what it actually meant to try to sleep in an era when night belonged to forces that daylight kept at bay. Now we arrive at the moment everyone had been anticipating or perhaps dreading: time to sleep. And when I say sleep, prepare to completely revise your concept of comfort and rest. The medieval bed would make any modern futon look like a luxury hotel mattress. First, let's discuss who actually had the privilege of sleeping in a real bed. Spoiler, it wasn't everyone. Most people slept on the floor on straw, animal skins, or, if they were fortunate, a thin mattress stuffed with straw, feathers, or old rags. The elevated bed, that marvel of engineering that set from the cold ground, was a luxury reserved for the more. But let's assume our artisan family had managed to acquire an actual bed. It was a wooden frame, typically made of oak or another sturdy wood, with a base of interwoven ropes or wooden planks. On top of this base sat what we'll generously call a mattress. The medieval mattress was essentially a large sack of rough fabric, linen or wool if the family was lucky, stuffed with straw, goose or duck feathers, sheep's wool, or a creative mixture of whatever was available. The poorest used straw exclusively, which had the advantage of being cheap and the considerable disadvantage of being straw. Imagine sleeping on a pile of dry grass that made noise with every movement, poked you in uncomfortable places, and needed regular replacement because it rotted or became home to insects. Feathers were better, but they had their own issues. First, they were expensive. Second, they had a tendency to escape through the fabric and float around the house, creating a constant indoor snowfall of plumes. Third, if not properly treated, they developed a distinctive smell that mixed barnyard with something forgotten at the back of a closet. The size of medieval beds was another interesting factor. They were smaller than modern beds, not just because people were physically shorter on average, but because sleeping curled up was considered healthier. Medical theory held that sleeping stretched out left your body vulnerable to harmful humors that could enter through your pores. So the fetal position wasn't just comfortable, it was doctor recommended. But here's the truly interesting part. People rarely slept alone. Medieval families practiced what we might call co-sleeping on an industrial scale. Parents, children, relatives, servants, guests, everyone squeezed onto whatever sleeping surfaces were available. Privacy was a luxury concept that most couldn't afford. Think of it as a nightly game of human Tetris, except with more elbows in inconvenient places and considerably more shared body heat. A typical family bed might easily accommodate 4, 5, or 6 people. Small children slept between parents. Older children took the edges. If a visitor arrived, there was always room to squeeze in one more person. Personal space was measured in fractions of inches. The bedding was another story altogether. Sheets were rare and considered a luxury. Most people covered themselves with animal furs, heavy wool blankets, or covers made from sewn-together scraps. These coverings were heavy, very heavy. Sleeping under them was somewhat like sleeping beneath a truck tarp, except hairier and with the distinctive aroma of damp animal. The bed linens that did exist were washed rarely, very rarely. We're talking once or twice a year, if that. It wasn't laziness, it was pure logistics. Washing bedding meant hauling water, heating it in large quantities, using expensive soap, and then drying everything, which in winter could take days. So the strategy was to endure the smell and hope the insects weren't too persistent. Speaking of insects, they were constant bed companions. Fleas, bed bugs, lice. A veritable entomological festival occurred nightly in medieval mattresses. People developed remarkable tolerance for these unwelcome visitors simply because there was no way to completely avoid them. You could pick off the ones you saw, but more always appeared. The height of the bed also served a practical purpose. The higher, the better. Not for status, but for safety. The floor was cold, damp, and inhabited by rats, insects, and other creatures that preferred not to be disturbed during human sleep. An elevated bed created a physical barrier between sleepers and the ground-level inhabitants of the house. Some more elaborate beds had curtains around them, not for privacy, but for protection against drafts. These heavy curtains created a microenvironment within the bed, transforming it into a sort of portable tent. It was warmer, certainly, though also more stuffy. But in medieval times, warmth trumped ventilation. And so our medieval family settled in for the night, piled into a bed that was part furniture, part zoo, part survival exercise. It was intimate by necessity, warm through accumulation of bodies, and comfortable only in comparison to sleeping on the cold, hard floor. But it was what they had, and people adapted with a resignation that makes any modern complaint about a firm mattress seemed like first-world luxury. Now, actually falling asleep was another challenge entirely. If you think achieving sleep in a medieval bed was challenging enough, wait until you hear about the soundtrack that accompanied every night. The medieval town after dark produced a symphony of sounds that would make any modern noise complaint seem quaint by comparison. Let's start with the most obvious source: other humans. In a house where 6 people shared the same mattress, snoring was inevitable. But these weren't individual organized snores. This was an orchestra of different timbres, rhythms, and intensities playing simultaneously without a conductor. There was father's deep rumble, mother's higher-pitched wheeze, the teenage son's intermittent honking, and the younger children's softer sighs and murmurs. Occasionally, someone talked in their sleep, creating one-sided conversations that ranged from bread recipes to embarrassing confessions. It was like having a podcast playing all night, except nobody had subscribed and you couldn't turn it off. But human sounds were just the opening act. The house itself was a massive, poorly tuned musical instrument. Wood creaked with every temperature change, and temperatures changed constantly. When it cooled, the wood contracted and groaned as if in pain. When it warmed slightly, it expanded and made snapping sounds that could startle you from near sleep. The wind was another persistent character in the nightly performance. Medieval houses weren't exactly airtight, so wind found countless ways to enter and exit, creating whistles, moans, and sighs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sometimes the wind made shutters rattle, doors groan, or simply created air currents that made candles flicker and cast dancing shadows on walls. Outside, the town had its own band. Dogs were omnipresent in medieval towns, not as pampered pets, but as street dogs, guard dogs, working dogs. And they barked at everything: a cat passing by, a rat scurrying, a shadow moving, another dog barking 3 streets away. Anything was sufficient reason for a canine concert that could last for hours. One bark would trigger another, which would trigger another, creating cascading waves of barking that rolled through the town like auditory dominoes. Cats contributed their own performances, especially during mating season. Medieval cats lived wilder lives than modern house cats. They were larger, more aggressive, and their nighttime mating calls sounded less like romantic serenades and more like declarations of war. The yowling of cats in heat was a sound that could wake the dead, or at least wake everyone who was trying to sleep. But it wasn't just domestic animals adding to the noise. Rats scurried through walls, making constant scratching and pattering sounds. Occasionally, a larger rat or even a weasel would decide to explore the house, creating sounds that made everyone wonder whether something much larger and more dangerous had found its way inside. Insects added their own layer to the soundscape. The buzzing of mosquitoes was constant in summer, creating an irritating, high-pitched drone that accompanied any attempt to sleep. Large flies bumped against walls and shutters, making a noise disproportionate to their size. And then there were the sounds from other houses. Those thin, permeable walls meant you heard your neighbors' lives in intimate detail. Conversations, arguments, crying babies, coughing, sneezing, and occasionally sounds that were better left unidentified. Acoustic privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. During winter, there was the constant crackling of the fire in the hearth. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? But imagine that sound for hours on end, mixed with the occasional pop of damp wood exploding or the rustle of ashes falling. And when the wind changed direction, smoke would sometimes back up through the chimney, bringing with it a sound of turbulence that made everyone cough. Storms were particularly dramatic events. Without lightning rods or proper drainage, every heavy rain was an acoustic adventure. Water pounded on thatched or wooden roofs with an intensity that made it sound like someone was throwing stones from above. Wind howled between houses, and occasionally there came the sinister sound of something being torn away or broken by nature's force. And we can't forget the religious sound. Church bells rang at regular intervals throughout the night, marking the canonical hours for prayer, matins, lauds, prime. Each moment was announced by bells that echoed the entire town. For those unaccustomed to it, it was like having a giant alarm clock that went off every 2 or 3 hours throughout the night. Then there were more ominous sounds, distant shouts, the sound of fighting, or the clip-clop of horses galloping through stone streets, which could mean anything from a medical emergency to the arrival of soldiers or bandits. These sounds were part of the urban soundscape that people learned to identify and often to ignore. It was in this sonic environment that people attempted to sleep. There were no noise-canceling headphones, no acoustic insulation, no way to simply shut out the world beyond your walls. Medieval sleep was an exercise in adaptation and endurance that makes any modern insomnia complaint seem rather trivial. You simply learned to sleep through it, or you didn't sleep much at all. Now that we've established that medieval sleep was an acoustic challenge, let's discuss thermal comfort, or the complete lack thereof. Temperature control in a medieval house was an art that mixed science, luck, and a generous dose of resignation. It was rather like playing a game where the rules changed with every season, and you were never quite sure whether you'd wake up frozen or roasted. Winter was obviously the great villain of the story. Imagine a house made of wood, mud, and straw, with windows that didn't close properly, walls that let wind pass through, and a heating system that consisted essentially of a fireplace in the middle of the room. The physics were simple and cruel. Heat rose, cold entered from below, and whoever slept far from the fireplace simply resigned themselves to a night of shivering. The medieval fireplace was a temperamental beast. When it worked well, it created an intense heat zone within about 6 feet. Anyone near it roasted, anyone far from it froze. There was no middle ground, and keeping the fire burning all night was both a logistical and financial challenge. Wood cost money, and leaving a fire unattended was an invitation to accidental conflagration. The most common strategy was to let the fire die slowly during the night, using the remaining embers to maintain some warmth. But this meant waking up in a freezing house with a temperature that made winter mornings in any modern city seem tropical by comparison. The first person to wake up, usually the woman of the house, had the honorable mission of rekindling the fire by blowing on the embers and feeding them with dry kindling. Sleeping clothes were a matter of survival, not style. People slept wearing essentially the same clothes they'd worn during the day, just removing the outermost layers. Specific nightwear was a luxury few could afford. The strategy was layers. A linen shirt underneath, a tunic on top, and if it was particularly cold, a cloak or cape as well. Feet were a particular problem. Heavy socks were expensive and rare. Most people slept with their feet wrapped in rags or animal furs. Some fortunate souls had soft leather shoes they could wear in bed, but most simply hoped that shared body heat would be sufficient to keep their toes functional. But winter wasn't the only thermal challenge. Medieval summer had its own horrors. Without proper ventilation, houses transformed into human ovens. The same system that barely retained heat in winter became a heat trap in summer. Small, few windows meant poor air circulation. Opening windows at night helped with ventilation, but also invited insects, noises, and occasionally unwanted visitors. It was a constant dilemma: die of heat or face the dangers of the night. The shared body heat that was a blessing in winter became a curse in summer. 6 people in a small bed, covered with heavy furs in a house without ventilation. It was rather like sleeping in a medieval sauna. Sweat was constant, smells intensified, and irritability increased exponentially. Humidity was another complicating factor. Medieval houses had no adequate protection against moisture. When it rained, water found creative ways to enter. Leaks were common, and humidity accumulated in walls, creating an environment conducive to mold and mildew that nobody quite knew how to address. In winter, this humidity would freeze, creating a layer of frost on the interior walls of the house. Waking up to see ice formed on your bedroom wall was an experience that makes any complaint about air conditioning being too cold seem rather precious. Damp bedding was a recurring nightmare, whether from leaks, condensation, or simply excessive humidity. Waking up with a wet mattress was common, and drying a medieval mattress wasn't exactly practical, especially in winter when everything took days to dry. Sudden temperature changes were particularly challenging. A warm summer day could be followed by a surprisingly cold night, catching everyone unprepared. There was no reliable weather forecast, so people had to prepare for any eventuality, which usually meant carrying extra clothes and hoping not to need them. And then there were extreme weather events: hailstorms that could break windows and damage roofs, blizzards that blocked doors and windows, heat waves that killed people and animals, droughts that lasted months. Nature was an unpredictable and powerful force, and people had very little control over how it affected their sleep and comfort. It was in this environment of constant thermal adaptation that medieval families tried to rest. No thermostats, no central heating, no air conditioning, just human ingenuity, some animal furs, and a remarkable physical resilience that makes any modern complaint about room temperature seem like ultimate luxury. We now arrive at one of the more, shall we say, aromatic aspects of medieval nightlife: personal hygiene. And when I say it was a concept in development, I'm being medieval hygiene generous. Operated on a completely different logic from ours, based on medical theories that would give any modern dermatologist nightmares. Let's begin with bathing, or rather, the absence of it. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people weren't completely averse to water. They simply had a complicated relationship with it. Medical theory of the time stated that water opened your skin's pores, making your body vulnerable to diseases and harmful humors that floated in the air. Therefore, a full bath was considered dangerous to your health. Think of it as believing that showering makes you sick, except this belief was backed by the medical establishment of the time. The frequency of baths varied drastically according to social class and season. A nobleman might indulge in a monthly bath, which was already considered excessive by some physicians. The middle class made do with quarterly or seasonal baths. The poor? Well, let's say they developed impressive resistance to their own body odors. When someone did decide to bathe, it was quite an event. First, you had to heat large quantities of water, a process that could take hours. Then you filled a wooden tub that usually sat in the kitchen near the hearth. The water was shared by the entire family, starting with the head of household and descending through the family hierarchy. Imagine the water quality by the time it reached the fifth or sixth person. Soap existed but was expensive and harsh. It was made from animal fat and wood ash, creating a substance that cleaned but also irritated the skin. Most people use soap only for special occasions, preferring plain water or herbal infusions for regular cleaning. But if full baths were rare, daily hygiene functioned in other ways. People practiced what they called dry cleaning, rubbing the body with clean cloths to remove sweat and surface dirt. It was rather like a medieval version of wet wipes, except without the wet part. Changing underclothes was considered a form of hygiene. The linen shirt that had direct contact with skin was changed regularly, at least once a week, if the family had enough clothing. The theory was that clean clothes absorbed the body's dirt, functioning as a sort of textile filter. Teeth were another interesting chapter in medieval hygiene. Toothbrushes didn't exist, but people used sticks chewed until the ends frayed, creating an improvised brush. They also rubbed teeth with rough cloths and used mixtures of salt, herbs, and spices to clean their mouths. Medieval breath was a unique sensory experience, mixing garlic, onions, unbrushed teeth, and occasionally decaying teeth. Hair received special attention, especially from women. It was brushed daily with combs made of wood or bone and washed occasionally with mixtures of herbs and water, but occasionally could mean once a month or less. The result was hair that functioned as its own ecosystem, hosting an impressive variety of small inhabitants. Nails were cut with small knives or simply bitten. Medieval manicure consisted of keeping nails short enough not to interfere with work, but not necessarily clean. Dirt under the nails was considered normal and even expected, especially for those who worked with their hands. Female hygiene during menstruation was a particular challenge. Women used linen cloths that were washed and reused when possible. But the logistics of washing meant clean cloths weren't always available. It was a time when creativity and physical resilience were essential for survival. The use of perfumes and essences was common among those who could afford them, but not to mask body odors, rather to ward off disease. It was believed that strong, pleasant smells created a barrier against the miasmas that caused plagues. So people drenched themselves in rose water, lavender, or other essence, creating an olfactory mixture that combined expensive perfume with aged sweat. Nighttime oral hygiene consisted basically of rinsing with water or watered wine, if available. Some people chewed aromatic herbs like mint or parsley, but most simply went to bed with the taste of their last meal still in their mouths. And then there was the matter of physiological needs during the night. The bathroom was outside the house. It was a proper bathroom. Most houses had a latrine in the yard, basically a hole in the ground with a wooden structure over it. Going to the bathroom in the middle of the night meant leaving the house in the cold, in the dark, facing all the dangers of the medieval night. The alternative was the chamber pot, a ceramic container that sat under the bed or in a corner of the room. The chamber pot was emptied in the morning, usually by tossing the contents out the window or carrying them to the latrine. The smell of a used chamber pot was yet another element in the aromatic symphony of the medieval house. For those brave or desperate enough to venture outside to the latrine at night, the experience was an adventure in itself. The path to the outhouse was dark, uneven, and potentially dangerous. The latrine itself was a simple structure that offered no protection from the elements and attracted flies and other insects in impressive numbers. It was in this atmosphere of creative hygiene and complex odors that medieval families attempted to get a good night's sleep. It was an environment that would make any modern person run for the nearest shower, but for them, it was simply the reality of life, a reality that required resilient noses and an impressive capacity for olfactory adaptation. If you thought the physical challenges of medieval sleep were sufficient, wait until we explore the psychological challenge. The medieval night wasn't just dark and uncomfortable, it was populated by an impressive quantity of creatures, spirits, and supernatural phenomena that made any modern horror film seem like an educational cartoon. Medieval darkness was different from our modern urban darkness. There were no streetlights, no distant glow of illuminated buildings, not even the guaranteed presence of the moon every night. When it was cloudy, the darkness was absolute, dense, almost tangible. It was the kind of darkness that made imagination work in overdrive, transforming any shadow into a potential threat. And the medieval imagination was particularly creative when it came to explaining nighttime sounds and phenomena. That creak in the wood could be a restless spirit. The howling wind might be the souls of those who died without confession. The distant barking of dogs might indicate they were seeing something human eyes couldn't perceive. Superstitions about sleep were numerous, specific. Sleeping on your back was considered dangerous because it left your body vulnerable to demons that could enter through your mouth. Sleeping with your feet pointing toward the door was an invitation for death to enter the house. Leaving mirrors uncovered during the night could attract evil spirits that would become trapped in the reflection. Dreams were taken very seriously, not as products of the subconscious mind, but as direct messages from the spiritual world. Dreaming of water could indicate impending death. Dreaming of talking animals was a sign that witches were trying to communicate. Dreaming of dead people meant they had something important to tell the living. Witches were a constant concern. It was believed they could enter houses during the night, suck the blood of children, or cast curses on entire families. To protect against them, people hung horseshoes on doors, sprinkled salt on windows, and kept iron objects near the bed, because everyone knew that supernatural creatures had allergies to iron. Vampires and blood-sucking demons were also part of the medieval nocturnal bestiary. These weren't the romantic vampires we know today, but horrible creatures that fed on human blood and left their victims pale and weak. To protect against them, people used garlic, crosses, and holy water when they could convince a priest to bless some. Werewolves were another real concern. In regions where wild wolves still existed, the line between reality and superstition was particularly thin. Anyone who behaved strangely during a full moon could be suspected of lycanthropy, and since strange behavior could include insomnia, irritability, or simply having nightmares, many innocent people ended up viewed with suspicion. Children were considered particularly vulnerable during the night. It was believed that demons could swap human babies for their own children, the famous changelings. To protect children, parents placed iron objects in cradles, made crosses on children's foreheads with holy water, and sometimes even tied bells to babies' wrists so any suspicious movement would be immediately detected. Death was a constant presence in medieval homes. With high infant mortality and low life expectancy, it was common for someone to die at home, and the dead, according to popular belief, didn't always depart immediately for the afterlife. They could remain wandering the house for days or weeks, especially if they had died with some pending matter or without receiving last rites. Family ghosts were almost accepted as part of the household. That shadow passing through the corridor might be grandmother who died last year. The sound of footsteps in the attic might be uncle who fell from the roof and never found his way to heaven. As long as the spirits weren't aggressive, families learned to coexist with them. But not all spirits were benign. Medieval poltergeists were particularly problematic, throwing objects, making inexplicable noises, and sometimes even physically attacking residents. When a house was haunted by a violent spirit, the family had few options: call a priest to perform an exorcism, move to another house, or simply endure and hope the spirit would tire and leave. The Catholic Church had an ambiguous position on these beliefs. Officially, it discouraged pagan superstitions, but in practice, it incorporated many of them into Christian rituals. Holy water, crosses, specific prayers, saints' relics. All of this served as protection against the forces of before darkness. Bed weren't just a religious habit, they were a spiritual shield against the dangers of night. Entire families recited the Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, and specific prayers for nighttime protection. Some prayers were so specific, they included requests for protection against nocturnal demons, evil spirits, and creatures that walk in darkness. Amulets and talismans were common across all social classes. Small crosses, saints' medals, pieces of martyrs' bones, teeth from animals considered sacred. All of this was used as personal protection during sleep. Children often slept with small bags of protective herbs sewn into their clothing. The position of the bed in the house was also important, never facing the main door, as that would facilitate the entry of evil spirits, preferably against a solid wall so nothing could approach from behind, and always with some blessed object nearby, a cross, a saint's image, or at least some blessed salt. Eclipses, comets, and other astronomical phenomena were interpreted as signs that supernatural forces were particularly active. During these nights, families took more prayers, more amulets, and sometimes complete vigils to ensure nothing bad happened while they slept. It was in this environment of constant spiritual vigilance that people tried to relax and sleep. Every noise needed analysis. Was it just the wind or something more sinister? Every shadow required investigation. Was it just the candlelight flickering or a supernatural presence? Medieval sleep required not just physical endurance, but psychological courage that makes any modern nighttime fear seem rather like a pampered child's worry. After hours facing cold, heat, noises, smells, fears, and every imaginable discomfort, our medieval family finally reached the most anticipated moment of the night, dawn. But don't think that waking in a medieval town was like waking today, with an alarm clock ringing. The medieval awakening was a gradual, collective, and often traumatic experience. The first sign that night was ending came not from sunlight, but from the sound of church bells ringing matins, the first canonical prayer of the day. This ringing happened while it was still dark, around 3 or 4 in the morning, depending on the season. It was like a giant alarm clock announcing to the entire town that it was time to start thinking about waking up, even though hours remained until the sun appeared. But who actually woke with the matins bells? Mainly the religious, some workers who needed to start early, and people who simply hadn't managed to sleep well during the night. Most of the population continued sleeping, or trying to, until the next bells, prime, which rang at sunrise. Waking in a medieval bed was an experience in itself. Imagine 6 people piled into a small mattress covered with heavy, smelly furs after a night of snoring, involuntary movements, and shared body heat. The first person to wake had to carefully disentangle themselves from the other bodies, avoiding waking everyone in the process. It was rather like playing human Jenga, except with more elbows and less patience. The first moments awake in a medieval house were particularly unpleasant. The air was stale after a night with closed windows and several people breathing in the same small environment. The smell was a complex mixture of sweat, morning breath, residual smoke from the hearth, and the aromas of the chamber pot that had been used during the night. The house's temperature in the morning was always an unpleasant surprise. If it was winter, the hearth fire had gone out during the night, leaving the house as cold as a medieval refrigerator. If it was summer, the heat accumulated during the night, combined with the body heat of several people, transformed the house into a poorly ventilated sauna. The first task of the day was always to rekindle the fire. This generally fell to the woman of the house, who had to blow on the embers remaining from the previous night, feed them with dry kindling, and gradually build a flame that could heat the house and prepare the first meal of the day. It was a process that could take an hour or more depending on the state of the embers and the person's skill. While the fire was being rekindled, the rest of the family began to move slowly. Children were the last to wake, naturally, and often needed to be carried from bed still half asleep. Men got up to check on animals if there were any, or to prepare for the day's work. Morning hygiene was minimal. A bit of cold water on the face if water was available. Brushing teeth with a chewed stick, or simply rinsing with water. Changing clothes meant only changing the undershirt if a clean one was available. The medieval breakfast was a simple but important meal. Bread, if any had been left over from the night before, or if someone had gone to fetch fresh bread from the bakery. Weak beer or water, if it was safe to drink. Sometimes a bit of cheese or leftovers from the previous night's meal. It was a meal more about survival than gastronomic pleasure. But the true relief of dawn wasn't the food or the warmth of the rekindled fire. It was simply having survived another night. In an era when mortality was high and nighttime dangers were real, waking up alive and relatively intact was already a victory. The town streets also awakened gradually. The first to emerge were workers who needed to start early. Bakers, milkmen, water carriers. Then came merchants opening their shops and preparing their goods. Children appeared in the streets running and shouting, bringing life and energy to the alleys that hours before had been territory of shadows and mystery. Sunlight completely changed the town's personality. The same streets that at night were sinister and dangerous transformed into familiar and safe places. The threatening shadows of night revealed themselves as simple, everyday objects. The mysterious noises of darkness gave way to the comforting sounds of urban life. And so, our medieval family began another day, carrying with them the experience of having survived yet another night, in an era when sleeping was an adventure that mixed physical endurance, psychological courage, and a good dose of luck. It was an experience that makes any modern complaint about sleep quality seem like ultimate first-world luxury. They didn't have orthopedic mattresses, air conditioning, acoustic insulation, or guaranteed security. But they had something we may have lost: the capacity to adapt, to find comfort in small things, and to genuinely value the simple fact of waking up alive and healthy after a night that could have been much worse. It was a hard, uncomfortable, and often dangerous time. But it was also a time when people developed resilience and adaptability that makes us reconsider our own complaints about hard pillows or noisy neighbors. They slept poorly, but they slept with the awareness that each dawn was a blessing, each night survived was a victory, and each moment of rest, however uncomfortable, was a precious gift in a life that offered few guarantees. And so ends our journey into the past. If you enjoyed these glimpses into medieval nightlife, subscribe for more historical deep dives designed for relaxation and sleep. Let me know in the comments which period of history you'd like to explore next. Rest well, time traveler. Sweet dreams.